The sun hung like a molten copper coin in the vast Arizona sky, its merciless heat beating down on the parched earth below as Olivia Montgomery stumbled forward, her once fine blue dress torn and dusty, her vision blurring as she reached the abandoned well on the edge of nowhere. Her trembling fingers grasped the stone edge just as her legs finally gave out beneath her, the world spinning into darkness as she collapsed onto the sun-baked ground, miles from anything resembling civilization in the unforgiving summer of 1878. Daniel Reed pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare as he guided his chestnut gelding across the desert scrubland. 3 days of tracking strays from his small ranch had left him bone-tired and desperately low on water. His canteen held barely a swallow, and the nearest creek was still miles away. The abandoned Fletcher homestead with its old well stood as his only hope before the punishing heat claimed another victim in this merciless territory. As he crested the small rise, the stone circle of the well came into view, and with it, something unexpected, a splash of faded blue fabric against the dusty ground. Daniel straightened in his saddle, eyes narrowing as he made out the unmistakable form of a woman lying motionless beside the well. "Whoa there, Rusty," he murmured, pulling his horse to a stop and dismounting in one fluid motion. His spurs jingled as he approached cautiously, one hand hovering near the revolver on his hip, a necessary precaution in these parts where ambushes weren't uncommon. But as he drew closer, he saw no signs of threat, only a young woman, unconscious, her face flushed with heat and exposure. Her chestnut hair had mostly fallen from its pins, and the fine quality of her torn dress spoke of Eastern origins. She was clearly no frontier woman, yet here she lay, miles from anywhere a lady of her standing ought to be. Daniel knelt beside her, removing his gloves to press 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse fluttered beneath his touch, weak but present. He glanced at the well, then back to the woman, understanding immediately what had happened. She'd been seeking water, just as he was, but had succumbed to the heat before finding relief. With practiced movements, he unslung the rope from his saddle, secured it to the well's wooden frame, and lowered the attached bucket into the darkness below. The splash that followed was the sweetest sound he'd heard in days. The well wasn't dry after all. When he'd hauled up the bucket, Daniel dampened his bandana and gently pressed it to the woman's parched lips, then to her forehead and the pulse points at her wrists. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough from dust and disuse. A faint moan escaped her lips, her eyelids fluttering without opening. Daniel frowned, looking around at the empty landscape. Night would fall in a few hours, and with it, the biting cold of the desert after dark. He couldn't leave her here, but the nearest town, Silver Creek, was a good 3-hour ride away. "Don't you worry now," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." He fetched his canteen, carefully tipping a small amount of the precious water into her mouth. Some dribbled down her chin, but her throat worked reflexively, swallowing most of it. Encouraged, he gave her a bit more before refilling his canteen from the well. With gentle hands, Daniel lifted the unconscious woman, surprised at how light she felt despite the layers of her clothing. He secured her in his saddle before mounting behind her, one arm wrapped protectively around her waist as he turned Rusty toward home. His ranch was closer than town, and she needed shelter and care as quickly as possible. "Hang on, miss," he murmured as they set off at a careful pace. "Just hang on." The woman stirred against him, her head lolling back against his shoulder. For just a moment, her eyes opened, revealing irises the color of summer cornflowers, before closing again. As Daniel rode through the lengthening shadows, he wondered who she was and what desperate circumstances had brought her alone to this unforgiving corner of the territory. One thing was certain: whoever she was, her journey had nearly killed her. And something in the peaceful weight of her against his chest told him that his own journey had just taken an unexpected turn. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and crimson when Daniel's small ranch house came into view. It wasn't much a two-room cabin with a lean-to stable and corral, but it was solid, and it was his. After 5 years of saving every penny from cowpunching on larger spreads, he'd finally purchased this modest homestead and small herd. It wasn't the biggest ranch in the territory, but it was a start, his start. The woman remained unconscious, occasionally making soft sounds of distress as they rode. By the time they reached the cabin, her skin had grown alarmingly hot to the touch. Daniel dismounted carefully, cradling her against him as he carried her inside, kicking the door open with his boot. He laid her gently on his bed, little more than a sturdy wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress, but clean and comfortable enough. Working quickly, he lit the oil lamp on the table, illuminating the sparse but tidy interior of his home. In the warm glow of the lamp, he got his first proper look at her face. Despite the dust and exhaustion, she was strikingly beautiful. High cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips now cracked from dehydration. Her fine dress, though travel-stained and torn, was clearly expensive, with intricate embroidery and mother-of-pearl buttons. Daniel filled a basin with water from the barrel he kept inside and found a clean cloth. With careful movements, he began to bathe her face, wiping away the dust of the trail. Her skin burned beneath his touch. "Fever," he muttered, concern deepening the lines around his eyes. He'd seen men die from sun sickness before, strong, weathered cowboys who'd spent too long in the unforgiving heat without water. He hesitated, looking at her dress with its dozens of tiny buttons and layers. The proper thing would be to leave her fully clothed, but the practical part of him knew that her heavy clothing would only make the fever worse. After a moment's deliberation, he decided on a compromise, unfastening only the outer layers and her boots, leaving her shift and underthings intact to preserve her modesty. Even this limited task proved challenging, his calloused fingers fumbling with the delicate fastenings. When he'd finally managed to remove her outer dress and loosen her corset, he covered her with a light sheet and continued bathing her face and wrists with cool water throughout the night. Daniel kept vigil. He coaxed water between her lips at regular intervals and replaced the cool cloths on her forehead when they grew warm. Outside, the coyotes called to one another across the desert, their eerie voices rising and falling in the darkness beyond his windows. It was near dawn when the woman's eyes finally opened properly, confusion and fear flooding her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Where, her voice emerged as a croak, barely audible. Daniel, who had been dozing in a chair beside the bed, came instantly alert. "You're safe, miss," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I found you collapsed by Fletcher's old well yesterday. You were suffering from the heat, something fierce." She tried to sit up but fell back with a moan, one hand going to her head. "Easy now," he cautioned, reaching for the cup of water he kept ready. "You need to take it slow. Here, drink a little more." He supported her head as she drank, noticing how her eyes, those striking blue eyes, never left his face, watchful and wary despite her weakness. When she'd finished drinking, she sank back against the pillow. "Thank you," she whispered. "Daniel Reed," he offered, setting the cup aside. "This is my ranch, such as it is." She hesitated, wariness visible in the tightening of her lips before she answered. "Olivia Montgomery." "Miss Montgomery, you're a long way from anywhere a lady should be traveling alone. What brought you out to that abandoned homestead?" Immediately, her expression shuddered, fear flashing across her features before she controlled it. I was traveling to Silver Creek, the stagecoach was." She paused, swallowing hard. "There was an accident. I walked for so long." Her voice broke, and Daniel didn't press further. Whatever had happened, she wasn't ready to share the full story, and he wasn't the type to pry. A woman alone in the territory either had good reason to be there or good reason to be running from something. Neither was his business unless she chose to make it so. "Silver Creek's about 15 miles south of here," he said instead. "I can take you there when you're stronger. For now, you need rest." Relief softened her features. "You're very kind, Mr. Reed." Daniel, he corrected, standing to stretch his cramped muscles. Nothing kind about basic Christian charity, Miss Montgomery. Now I've got animals to tend, but I'll leave the door open so you can call if you need anything. Try to sleep if you can. She nodded, her eyelids already drooping despite her obvious effort to stay alert. Daniel paused at the doorway, looking back at the mysterious woman now sleeping in his bed. Who was Olivia Montgomery, and what had really brought her to the middle of nowhere? The stagecoach line didn't run anywhere near Fletcher's old place, which meant there was more to her story than she was telling. But as he stepped out into the pink light of dawn, Daniel decided that everyone was entitled to their secrets in this vast, unforgiving land. After all, he had plenty of his own. 3 days passed before Olivia was strong enough to sit up for more than a few minutes at a time. The fever had broken on the second night, leaving her weak, but lucid. Daniel had made her broth from his precious stores of dried beef and wild onions, coaxing her to eat a little more with each passing meal. They established an uneasy routine. He would bring her food and fresh water, ask after her comfort, and then retreat to give her privacy. Olivia, for her part, was unfailingly polite but revealed little about herself beyond the most basic details. She was from Boston. She had been traveling west to join her aunt in Silver Creek. The stagecoach had been attacked, she wouldn't say by whom, and she had fled into the desert, becoming lost and disoriented before finding the well. On the fourth morning, Daniel returned from feeding his small herd to find Olivia sitting at his rough-hewn table, wrapped in his spare blanket over her shift. Her hair, now clean thanks to the basin and pitcher he'd provided, hung in damp waves down her back. "You shouldn't be up," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Mr. Reed." Daniel, she corrected herself, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I need to regain my strength so I can continue to Silver Creek." Daniel frowned, taking in her still pale complexion and the way her hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. "You're not ready for that journey yet. Silver Creek may only be 15 miles, but it's 15 miles of open country with no water between here and there. Nevertheless, I cannot stay here indefinitely. It isn't proper." Her chin lifted slightly, a glimpse of stubbornness beneath her refined exterior. Daniel couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his mouth. "Proper went out the window when you collapsed in the desert, Miss Montgomery. But I understand your concern." He moved to the stove, adding wood to the banked coals. "Tell you what, I need to ride into town for supplies in a day or two anyway. Once you can stay on your feet for more than 5 minutes at a stretch, I'll take you to Silver Creek myself." Relief softened her expression. "That would be most appreciated." As Daniel prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with molasses, he glanced occasionally at his unexpected guest. In the morning light streaming through the small window, she looked younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, not much younger than his own 28 years. Despite her current disheveled state, there was an unmistakable elegance in the way she held herself, in the precise diction of her speech. "Your dress is mended as best I could manage," he said, placing a steaming bowl before her. "Though I fear my stitching would make any proper seamstress faint from horror." This earned him a genuine smile, the first he'd seen from her. "You sew, Mr. Reed?" "Every cowboy worth his salt can stitch up tears, Miss Montgomery. Clothes, saddles, occasionally our own hides when necessary." He sat across from her with his own bowl. "Out here you learn to be self-sufficient or you don't last long." Olivia contemplated him as she carefully spooned the hot mush. "And how long have you been lasting out here?" "Born in Texas," he replied. "Moved to the territory with my pa after the war when I was 16. Been working cattle ever since. Got this place 2 years ago. All alone." Something in her tone made him look up sharply, but her expression revealed only polite interest. "A man needs time to establish himself before thinking about company," he said carefully. "Of course." She turned her attention back to her breakfast, but not before Daniel caught the faint color rising in her cheeks again. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the distant lowing of cattle. Daniel found himself strangely aware of her presence across the table, the delicate way she ate, the occasional brush of her fingers against her hair, the scent of his own soap on her skin. "I noticed you have quite a collection of books," Olivia said eventually, nodding toward the small shelf where he kept his most prized possessions, a dozen well-worn volumes. Daniel felt a flash of self-consciousness. "My mother taught me to read before she passed. Figured I ought to keep the habit alive. May I?" At his nod, Olivia rose carefully and moved to examine the titles. "Shakespeare, Thoreau, Whitman," she glanced back at him with new interest. "You have eclectic taste for a cowboy, Mr. Reed," he shrugged, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Words help pass the time when winter sets in." "Indeed." She selected a slim volume of Tennyson's poetry and returned to her seat. "Would you mind if I borrowed this while I recover? Reading always helps me feel more myself." "Help yourself to any of them," Daniel said, rising to clear the dishes. "Though I should warn you, I tend to mark passages that speak to me. Hope that doesn't offend your sensibilities." Olivia opened the book, her fingers trailing over the penciled underlines and margin notes. "On the contrary," she murmured, "I find it fascinating to see which words have touched another soul." Something about the way she said it, soft and almost intimate, made Daniel turn away, suddenly very interested in washing the breakfast dishes. This woman was a temporary guest in his home, nothing more. In a few days, she'd be in Silver Creek with her aunt, and his life would return to its solitary rhythm. Yet as he watched her from the corner of his eye, absorbed in his dog-eared copy of Tennyson, he couldn't deny the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. That afternoon, the first drops of an unexpected summer storm began to patter against the cabin's roof. Daniel had been repairing a saddle on the porch when the dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them the rich, earthy scent of rain on parched ground. He hurried to secure his livestock and equipment, returning to the cabin drenched and grinning despite himself. Rain was always a blessing in this dry country, even when it came as a surprise. Inside, he found Olivia standing by the window, watching the downpour with undisguised wonder. "I've never seen rain come so suddenly," she said without turning. "One moment clear skies, the next this deluge." Daniel shrugged out of his wet coat. "Desert storms are like that, quick to come, quick to leave, and fierce while they last." He hung his coat by the door and ran a hand through his damp hair. "Course, this means we won't be heading to town for a while. These storms can turn the dry washes into raging rivers in minutes." Olivia's shoulders tensed slightly before she nodded. "I understand, safety must come first. I'll check my stores, see what we can piece together for supper." Daniel moved to the small pantry area, taking mental inventory of his supplies. With an unexpected guest, his carefully rationed provisions would run out more quickly than planned, but they'd manage. As he sorted through dried beans and the last of his flour, he heard Olivia's soft footsteps behind him. "Please, let me help," she offered. "I may not be accustomed to cooking in such rustic conditions, but I'm not entirely helpless." Daniel turned, surprised. "You cook, Miss Montgomery?" A shadow passed over her face. "Not officially, no. In Boston, we had staff for such things, but I often visited the kitchen. Our cook, Mrs. Winters, was kind enough to teach me some basics when my mother wasn't looking." She gave a small, rueful smile. "Mother thought cooking beneath a lady's dignity." "And what do you think?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Olivia met his gaze directly. "I think survival is never beneath anyone's dignity, Mr. Reed. And from what I've seen of this territory, knowing how to prepare a meal might be the difference between comfort and hardship." Daniel couldn't help but smile. "Well said." He gestured to the ingredients he'd gathered. "In that case, how do you feel about helping me prepare a pot of beans with the last of yesterday's cornbread?" For the next hour, they worked side by side in the small space. Daniel showed her how to sort the beans for stones, explaining his method for seasoning them with the precious salt pork he saved for special occasions. Olivia proved to be a quick study, asking intelligent questions and following his instructions carefully. When their fingers accidentally brushed as they worked, Daniel noticed how she no longer flinched away as she had during the first days of her stay. Instead, a subtle warmth colored her cheeks, but she continued their conversation without pause. As the storm raged outside, turning the world beyond the windows into a gray blur, the cabin grew increasingly cozy. Daniel added wood to the stove, and the rich aroma of simmering beans filled the small space. He found himself telling Olivia stories of his early days as a cowhand, the cattle drives to Dodge City. The characters he'd worked with, the slow accumulation of knowledge and savings that had eventually allowed him to purchase this modest spread. "You speak of it with such passion," Olivia observed as they finally sat down to eat. "Your land, your cattle, it clearly means a great deal to you." Daniel considered this as he broke a piece of cornbread. "A man needs something that's his," he said finally. "Something he's built with his own hands. Out here, that means land. Not just owning it, but understanding it, knowing where water flows beneath the surface, which grasses will nourish your stock, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds." "I envy that certainty," Olivia said quietly. "Knowing exactly what you want." There was something in her voice, a hesitation, perhaps even a note of loss that made Daniel look up sharply. "And what is it you want, Miss Montgomery, beyond reaching your aunt in Silver Creek, that is?" Olivia stared into her bowl for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the drumming rain. "Freedom, I suppose, the chance to determine my own path." Before Daniel could respond, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, making them both jump. It was followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark white, before plunging it back into the warm glow of the oil lamp. Olivia's hand had flown to her throat, her eyes wide. Daniel found himself fighting the inappropriate urge to reach across the table and cover her fingers with his own. "Storm's right overhead now," he said instead, rising to check that the windows were securely latched. "Might be a long night. Will your animals be safe?" Olivia asked, genuine concern in her voice. Daniel nodded, touched by her question. "The barn's solid and they've weathered worse." He returned to his seat. "The rain's good for the land, even if it's keeping us from town a bit longer." Olivia hesitated, then asked softly, "Does it bother you?" "Having to delay your plans because of me?" Daniel considered her carefully. In the lamplight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression open and uncertain, she looked nothing like the proper Boston lady she claimed to be. There was something vulnerable yet determined in her gaze that made him want to know her story, all of it, not just the carefully edited version she'd shared. "No," he said truthfully. "Can't say that it does." Something passed between them, then a moment of quiet understanding, perhaps even the first tendrils of trust. Olivia smiled, small but genuine, and returned to her meal. Outside, the storm continued its furious assault on the parched earth. But inside the cabin, a different kind of tension was slowly building, one made of shared glances, careful words, and the growing awareness of each other that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. As the days passed, Olivia's strength returned steadily. The rains had transformed the landscape, bringing a brief burst of green to the usually brown terrain. Small desert flowers bloomed in unexpected places, their vibrant colors dotting the land around Daniel's cabin. Each morning, Olivia insisted on helping with chores, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, even learning to milk the single cow Daniel kept for fresh dairy. Her city-bred hands grew calloused, and the sun kissed her fair skin despite the bonnet she fashioned from one of Daniel's old shirts. For his part, Daniel found himself increasingly aware of her presence in his previously solitary life. The way she hummed softly while washing dishes, the careful precision with which she folded laundry, The thoughtful questions she asked about his books in the evenings, all of it was slowly reshaping his routine in ways he hadn't anticipated. A week after her arrival, Daniel was repairing fence line when he spotted Olivia walking toward him across the meadow, carrying what appeared to be his canteen and a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might want some water and food," she called as she approached. "You've been working since dawn." Daniel straightened, pushing his hat back as he wiped sweat from his brow. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Miss Montgomery." "Olivia, please," she said, handing him the canteen. "After all, we've shared your home for a week now." It seems silly to stand on formality. Daniel drank deeply, studying her over the rim of the canteen. She looked different today, more confident, her posture relaxed as she gazed out over the greening landscape. The borrowed dress she wore, one of his mother's old ones that he'd kept packed away, was too large for her slender frame, but she'd cleverly taken it in with neat stitches and added a belt fashioned from a length of leather he'd given her. "Olivia," he agreed, testing the name on his tongue. It suited her, somehow elegant but with hidden strength, like the woman herself. She smiled at his use of her name, then unwrapped the bundle to reveal thick slices of bread spread with preserves. "I found these in your pantry. I hope you don't mind." "Last of my blackberry preserves," Daniel said, accepting a slice gratefully. "Been saving them for a special occasion." "Is this a special occasion?" Olivia asked, a teasing note in her voice that he hadn't heard before. Daniel took a bite to give himself time to think. The truth was, every day with her had begun to feel special in some indefinable way. The simple pleasure of conversation over meals, the shared quiet of evenings spent reading by lamplight, the gradual easing of formality between them, all of it had become precious to him in ways he hadn't expected. "Fence mending is hardly special," he said finally, keeping his tone light. "But company while doing it, that's rare enough to warrant breaking out the preserves, I'd say." Olivia settled on a nearby boulder, smoothing the borrowed dress over her knees. "The land looks different after the rain," she observed. "So much life hidden beneath the surface, just waiting for the right conditions." Daniel nodded, finishing his bread before returning to his work on the fence. "Desert's deceptive that way. Folks see it and think it's empty, dead. But it's just biding its time." He glanced at her. "Takes a certain kind of patience to appreciate it." "I never imagined I could find beauty in such a stark landscape," Olivia admitted. "In Boston, everything is so cultivated. Parks with perfectly trimmed hedges, gardens with flowers arranged by color and height." She gestured to a cluster of tiny purple blooms pushing up through a crack in the nearby rocks. "There's something honest about how life asserts itself here. No pretense, just determination." Daniel drove another fence post into the softened earth, considering her words. "That determination is what separates those who survive out here from those who don't," he said. "Land doesn't care about your background or your fine manners. It only respects work and will." Olivia was quiet for a moment, plucking a stem of grass and twirling it between her fingers. "And what about you, Daniel? What do you respect?" The question caught him off guard, making him pause mid-swing with his mallet. "Honesty," he said after a moment. "Self-reliance. And courage, especially the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures." Their eyes met across the fence line, and Daniel had the distinct impression that they weren't just talking about abstract virtues anymore. Olivia broke the gaze first, looking down at her hands. "The roads should be passable soon," she said softly. "I shouldn't impose on your hospitality much longer." Daniel returned to hammering with perhaps more force than necessary. "You're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered," he said, keeping his voice neutral despite the unexpected pang her words had caused. "No sense in rushing to town if you're not ready." "That's very kind, but—" Olivia hesitated. "I fear I've already stayed longer than propriety allows." Daniel set down his tools and faced her directly. "Olivia, we're 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. The only ones concerned with propriety out here are the coyotes, and they're not particularly judgmental." That startled a laugh from her, a genuine, unguarded sound that transformed her face. Daniel found himself smiling in response, captivated by this glimpse of the woman beneath the careful exterior. Besides, he continued more seriously, something tells me you're not being entirely forthcoming about your situation. I haven't pressed because it's not my place, but I get the feeling you're not in any hurry to reach Silver Creek. Not really. Olivia's expression shuddered, the brief moment of openness gone as quickly as it had appeared. She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. I should get back to the house. There's bread to finish baking. Olivia. Daniel's voice stopped her as she turned to leave. Whatever you're running from or to you're safe here, that's all I meant to say. She stood still for a long moment, her back to him, shoulders tense beneath the borrowed dress. Then, without turning, she said quietly, "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." As he watched her walk back toward the cabin, her figure small against the vast landscape, Daniel wondered what secrets she carried, and why the thought of her leaving filled him with such inexplicable dread. That evening, a tense silence hung between them as they prepared and ate supper. Olivia was polite but distant, responding to Daniel's attempts at conversation with brief, noncommittal answers. When the meal was finished, she immediately set about washing the dishes, her movements brisk and efficient. Daniel watched her from his seat at the table, turning his coffee cup between his palms. Something had shifted between them after their conversation at the fence line. A door that had been slowly opening had abruptly closed. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said finally. "The creek should be crossable by now and we're running low on supplies." Olivia's hands stilled in the wash basin. Will you inquire about my aunt while you're there, Elizabeth Montgomery? She was expecting me weeks ago." "Of course," Daniel agreed. "Though Silver Creek's not so big that a newcomer wouldn't be noticed. Strange that no one's come looking for you." Olivia resumed washing with renewed vigor. "Perhaps there was confusion about my arrival date." Daniel didn't respond, but his silence clearly communicated his skepticism. After a moment, Olivia sighed, drying her hands on a cloth before turning to face him. "You don't believe me." It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. "I believe something brought you to that well half dead from exposure. I believe you're educated, well-bred, and far from home. But no, I don't believe you're telling me the whole truth about why you're here or who you're meeting." Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "You've been nothing but kind to me, Daniel. You deserve honesty, but my situation is complicated." "Most worth talking about are," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'm a fair hand at complicated myself." After a moment's hesitation, Olivia sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I do have an aunt in Silver Creek, that much is true, but she doesn't know I'm coming. I haven't seen her since I was a child. She left the family under difficult circumstances." "Circumstances that you're now repeating," Daniel guessed. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "You're more perceptive than most men of my acquaintance." "Fewer distractions out here," Daniel said with a slight shrug. "Makes a man notice things." She took a deep breath as if making a decision. "I was engaged to be married in Boston, a man my father's age but with considerable business interests that aligned with my father's. The match was advantageous. For everyone but you, I take it," Daniel said quietly. Olivia's laugh held no humor. "Edward Harrington is a respected businessman with impeccable social connections. He's also controlling, cruel when no one is watching, and determined to have a wife who is nothing more than a decorative possession." Her voice hardened. "I refused the match. My father gave me an ultimatum: marry Edward or be cut off without a penny." "So you ran," Daniel concluded. "With only what money I could secretly save and my mother's jewelry sewn into my hems," Olivia confirmed. "I remembered my Aunt Elizabeth, my mother's sister, who had caused a family scandal by marrying a man beneath her station and moving west. My father forbade her name to be mentioned, but my mother occasionally received letters in secret. And you hope to find her in Silver Creek." Olivia nodded, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. It's my only hope, if Edward or my father's men have followed me." She trailed off, fear flashing across her features. "That's what happened at the stage stop, isn't it?" Daniel asked gently. "You weren't attacked by bandits, you were running from someone who recognized you?" "One of the passengers," Olivia admitted. "A business associate of Edward's. I slipped away during a stop and just ran. I thought I could find my way to the next station, but I became disoriented in the heat." She looked up at him, vulnerability plain in her expression. "If you hadn't found me when you did." "But I did," Daniel said firmly. "And now we know what we're dealing with." "We," Olivia repeated, hope and wariness mingling in her voice. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Olivia, I'm not about to send you into town unprepared if there's a chance someone's looking for you. Let me go tomorrow, ask some discreet questions. If your aunt is there, I'll find a way to get word to her privately." Relief softened her features. "You would do that for me, even knowing I've not been entirely truthful?" "We've all got reasons for the choices we make," Daniel said simply. "I don't figure it's my place to judge yours." Impulsively, Olivia reached across the table and covered his hand with her own. "Thank you, Daniel. I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." Daniel was acutely aware of the warmth of her touch, the softness of her skin against his weather-roughened hand. "No repayment necessary," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just part of being a good neighbor." Olivia smiled, withdrawing her hand slowly. "Is that what we are, neighbors?" There was something in her tone, a tentative question that went beyond the words themselves. Daniel found himself at a crossroads, knowing that his response would shift something fundamental between them. "For now," he said carefully, "unless you'd prefer another word." Color bloomed in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. I think friends might be a good place to start." "Friends," Daniel agreed, ignoring the part of him that already wanted more. "I can live with that." That night, as Daniel lay on his makeshift bedroll in the main room of the cabin, listening to Olivia's soft breathing from his bed in the small adjoining bedroom, he contemplated the complications her presence had introduced to his carefully ordered life. He'd worked hard for his independence, for the right to answer to no one but himself and the land. Entanglements, especially with a woman clearly meant for a different life than the one he could offer, hadn't been part of his plan. Yet as he drifted towards sleep, he couldn't deny that the cabin already felt different with her in it. Warmer somehow. Less like a place to rest between work and more like something he'd once imagined but had stopped believing he might have, a home. Dawn was breaking when Daniel saddled Rusty for the ride into Silver Creek. Olivia stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, watching as he checked his saddle bags one final time. "I've made a list," she said, holding out a carefully folded piece of paper. "Of things to ask about my aunt. Her husband's name was Joseph Miller. They might have children by now, I don't know." Daniel tucked the paper into his shirt pocket. "I'll be discreet," he promised, "and I'll bring back whatever news I can find." Olivia stepped closer, laying a hand on Rusty's neck. "Be careful," she said quietly, "if Edward has sent men looking for me." "I can handle myself," Daniel assured her, adjusting his hat. "Keep the door locked while I'm gone. I should be back by nightfall, but if I'm delayed, there's extra ammunition in the drawer beside the bed." She nodded, her expression serious. "I'll manage." For a moment they stood in silence, neither quite ready to part. Then Olivia straightened her shoulders and stepped back. "Safe journey, Daniel. Take care, Olivia." With a final nod, he swung into the saddle and turned Rusty toward town, forcing himself not to look back until he'd crested the first rise. When he did, she was still standing on the porch, a solitary figure against the weathered wood of the cabin. Daniel lifted his hand in a final farewell, before urging Rusty into a canter. The sooner he reached town, the sooner he could return with the information Olivia needed. Silver Creek was bustling with activity when Daniel arrived shortly before noon. The recent rains had brought ranchers and farmers into town for supplies, and the main street was crowded with wagons and horses. He tied Rusty outside the general store and stepped inside, taking a moment to let his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. "Well, if it isn't the hermit of Cottonwood Creek," called Samuel Wilson, the store's proprietor, from behind the counter. "Thought you might have washed away in that deluge we had." "Takes more than a little rain to drown me, Sam," Daniel replied, making his way through the crowded aisles. "Need to stock up, though. Supplies running lower than I expected." Sam raised an eyebrow at Daniel's unusually large order but made no comment as he began gathering the items. "Heard about any trouble on the stage route recently?" Daniel asked casually as Sam measured out flour into a sack. "Funny you should ask," Sam said, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Stage came in 3 days late last week. Driver was tight-lipped about it, but one of the passengers let slip there'd been some kind of incident out near Flint Ridge. No bandits from what I gather, but a female passenger went missing." Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Missing how?" Sam shrugged. "Story's unclear. Some say she wandered off during a rest stop and got lost. Others whisper she was running from something or someone." He gave Daniel a shrewd look. "Why the interest? Not like you to care about town gossip." "Just making conversation," Daniel said, selecting a bolt of serviceable cotton fabric from a nearby shelf. At Sam's questioning look, he added, "Getting cold at night. Thought I'd make another quilt." If Sam doubted this explanation, he didn't say so, instead continuing to fill Daniel's order. As he worked, Daniel casually asked about newcomers to town, particularly anyone named Montgomery or Miller. "Elizabeth Miller," Sam scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Sure, she runs the millinery shop down by the church. Been here, must be 15 years now. Respectable woman, keeps to herself mostly. Husband passed some years back, mining accident over in Silverado. Has a boy about 17, works over at the livery." Relief coursed through Daniel. Olivia's aunt was real and established in the community. "Appreciate the information, Sam. Might stop by her shop while I'm in town. Need a new hat band." After settling his account at the general store, Daniel loaded his purchases onto Rusty and made his way to the millinery shop. A small bell tinkled as he entered, and a woman looked up from behind a counter where she was carefully stitching feathers onto a hat brim. Elizabeth Miller was perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and deep lines at the corners of her eyes. Yet Daniel could see the family resemblance immediately: the same delicate bone structure, the same striking blue eyes that Olivia possessed. "Good afternoon," she greeted him. "How may I help you?" Daniel removed his hat, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. "Madam, I was hoping for a private word if you can spare the time." Elizabeth's expression grew wary. "Regarding what matter, sir?" Glancing around to ensure they were alone, Daniel stepped closer to the counter. "Regarding your niece, Olivia Montgomery." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then, with remarkable composure, she moved to the shop door, turned the sign to "closed," and locked it. "Who are you?" she demanded, turning back to Daniel. "Has something happened to Olivia? My name is Daniel Reed. I have a small ranch about 15 miles north of town," he explained quickly. "Miss Montgomery is safe, madam. She's at my cabin, recovering from exposure. I found her collapsed at an abandoned well a week ago." Elizabeth pressed a hand to her heart. "Thank God she's alive. I received a letter months ago saying she might come west, but with no details, when I heard about the missing passenger." Her voice broke slightly. "Is she truly well?" "Getting stronger every day," Daniel assured her, "but she's concerned about being followed." "A man named Edward Harrington—" "That monster," Elizabeth interrupted, her gentle features hardening with sudden anger. "My sister wrote to me of the match. It was her last letter before she passed, begging me to help Olivia if she ever reached out." She studied Daniel intently. "And now you've brought me word of her. Why, you could have simply brought her to town." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "She's afraid, Mrs. Miller, afraid of being found before she could reach you safely. I thought it best to make sure the way was clear first." Elizabeth considered him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You've shown great care for my niece, Mr. Reed. I'm grateful." She moved behind the counter and scribbled a note on a piece of paper. "Here is my address. Bring Olivia there after dark tomorrow. Use the back entrance by the garden. I'll be watching for you." As Daniel tucked the paper into his pocket, Elizabeth added, "There have been men asking questions in town. Well-dressed men from back east, not the usual sort we see here. They've been discreet, but in a town this size, people notice strangers." "Have they come to your shop?" Daniel asked, concern sharpening his voice. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time before someone mentions the connection." Elizabeth's expression was resolute. "I'll be ready to leave if necessary. Joseph left me enough to start over elsewhere if needed." Daniel nodded, understanding the implicit trust she was placing in him. "I'll bring her safely, Mrs. Miller, you have my word." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth called after him softly. "Mr. Reed, what is she to you?" The question caught him off guard. What was Olivia to him? A woman he'd saved. A temporary guest in his home, or something more, something he hadn't yet dared to name. "Someone worth protecting," he said finally. Elizabeth's knowing smile suggested she heard the words he hadn't spoken. "Then I look forward to making your better acquaintance, Mr. Reed." The ride back to the ranch seemed interminable, despite Rusty's steady pace. Daniel's mind raced with all he'd learned, the confirmation of Olivia's story, the presence of men asking questions in town, the arrangements for tomorrow night's meeting. So focused was he on these thoughts that he nearly missed the subtle signs as he approached his property: the disturbed pattern of dust on the trail, the unnatural silence in the trees surrounding his land. Daniel slowed Rusty to a walk, every sense suddenly alert. Something was wrong. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the landscape, but it was still light enough to see that the cabin door stood partially open. Olivia would never have left it that way, not after his warnings. Heart pounding, Daniel dismounted quietly and tied Rusty in a small copse of trees out of sight from the cabin. He drew his revolver and moved forward cautiously, using the scattered boulders and scrub brush for cover. As he drew closer, he caught the sound of voices: a man's, harsh and demanding, and then Olivia's, tight with fear but defiant. Daniel crept to the side of the cabin, positioning himself beneath the window that looked into the main room. "Waste any more time," the male voice was saying. "Your father has authorized me to bring you back by any means necessary. This childish escapade ends now." "I'm not going anywhere with you, Mr. Prescott," Olivia replied, her voice stronger than Daniel had expected. "My father has no authority over me any longer." "That's where you're wrong, Miss Montgomery," Prescott said, his tone coldly amused. "A woman in your position has very few legal rights, especially one who has compromised her reputation as thoroughly as you have. Living unchaperoned with a man and a common rancher at that." "Your father was quite distressed to hear of it." "How did you find me?" Olivia demanded. "Simple deduction and a healthy bribe to the station master at Flint Ridge. He remembered a woman matching your description heading north on foot. After that, it was just a matter of checking every homestead in the area." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps moving across the floor. "Now gather whatever belongings you've acquired and come along quietly. The stage leaves at dawn." "And if I refuse?" The man's laugh held no humor. "Then I'll be forced to use methods less pleasant than persuasion. Your father was most explicit about the latitude I'm permitted in bringing you home." Daniel had heard enough. With silent movements born from years of stalking wary cattle, he made his way to the front of the cabin and positioned himself beside the door, gun ready. "Olivia," he called clearly, "step away from the door." Inside, there was a sudden silence, then a commotion of movement. "Reed." Prescott snarled. "Drop your weapon and come inside or the woman gets hurt." Daniel's blood ran cold. "You harm one hair on her head and they'll be finding pieces of you across 3 counties, he replied, his voice deadly calm. "Olivia, are you all right?" "Yes," she called back, her voice strained. "He has a gun, Daniel, one I'm quite willing to use," Prescott added. "I've been authorized to eliminate any complications." Daniel considered his options. Rushing in would put Olivia at risk, but waiting too long might give Prescott time to formulate an escape plan. Decision made, he called out, "All right, I'm coming in. Don't do anything foolish." Slowly, he pushed the door open with his foot, keeping his revolver trained ahead of him. The scene inside made his jaw clench. Prescott, a tall man in an expensive but travel-worn suit, had Olivia by the arm, a small derringer pressed to her side. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes finding Daniel's immediately. "Drop the gun, Reed," Prescott ordered. "Now." Daniel kept his revolver steady. "Not happening. You're on my property, threatening a woman under my protection. That puts you at a distinct disadvantage." "I have legal authority. You have nothing here," Daniel cut him off. "This isn't Boston. Out here, a man stands on his own actions, not on papers or family connections." Prescott's face contorted with anger. "You're nothing but an ignorant cowboy. This woman is promised to another man, a man of position and wealth. Step aside and forget you ever met her, and you might live to see another sunset." Daniel's gaze never left Olivia's. In her eyes, he saw not just fear but determination and something else: trust. She trusted him to find a way out of this. "Olivia," he said calmly, "when I give the word, drop to the floor." Prescott tightened his grip on her arm. "She moves, she dies." "Then we have a problem," Daniel replied, "because she's not going anywhere with you." Time seemed to stretch, the tension in the room building with each passing second. Daniel could see beads of sweat forming on Prescott's forehead, could sense the man's increasing agitation. An agitated man with a gun was dangerous, unpredictable. Then from outside came an unexpected sound, the whinny of Prescott's horse, followed by a loud crash. The momentary distraction was all Daniel needed. "Now, Olivia." She twisted violently out of Prescott's grasp, dropping to the floor as Daniel fired. His shot caught Prescott in the shoulder, spinning the man backward. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Prescott fell, crying out in pain and surprise. Daniel was across the room in 2 strides, kicking the small gun away and pressing the barrel of his revolver against Prescott's chest. "Don't move," he growled. Olivia scrambled to her feet, breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked without taking his eyes off Prescott. "No," she assured him, moving quickly to retrieve a length of rope from the corner. "Here." Together, they bound Prescott's hands and feet, ignoring his stream of threats and curses. When he was secured, Daniel finally allowed himself to look properly at Olivia. There was a bruise forming on her cheek and her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear and focused. "You came back," she said simply. "Of course I did," Daniel replied. "It's my home." The smile that bloomed across her face made his heart stutter. "Yes," she agreed softly, "it is." With Prescott securely tied, and his wound bandaged not out of compassion but practical necessity, Daniel and Olivia retreated to the porch to discuss their next steps. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in fiery gold and deep purple shadows. "I found your aunt," Daniel said, leaning against the porch railing. "She's expecting us tomorrow night. She knows about your situation and is prepared to help." Relief flooded Olivia's features. "She's really there, after all this time," Daniel nodded, "running a millinery shop. Respected in the community. Her husband passed some years back, but she has a son, your cousin, working at the livery." He hesitated, then added, "She mentioned men asking questions in town. I think Prescott wasn't working alone." Olivia's expression darkened. "Edward would have sent multiple agents to find me. He's nothing if not thorough." She glanced back at the cabin where Prescott lay trussed and seething. "What do we do with him?" "Sheriff in Silver Creek is a fair man," Daniel said. "We'll take Prescott in, charge him with trespassing and assault. That should hold him long enough for us to get you safely to your aunt and figure out next steps." "And then what?" Olivia asked, her voice small. "Do I spend my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for Edward or my father to send someone else?" Daniel turned to face her fully. "That depends on what you want, Olivia." "What I want," she gave a hollow laugh. "I've spent so long being told what I should want that I'm not sure I know anymore." Then maybe it's time to figure it out, Daniel suggested gently. Your aunt built a new life here, you could too. Olivia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving over the modest ranch, the small corral where Rusty now grazed, the vegetable garden she'd helped weed, the weathered cabin that had become a sanctuary. Finally, she met Daniel's eyes. When I first came west, all I wanted was escape, she admitted. Freedom from a future that had been decided for me, but now. She took a deep breath. Now I find myself wanting things I never considered before. Such as, Daniel prompted, hardly daring to breathe. Olivia stepped closer, close enough that he could see the last rays of sunlight reflected in her eyes. A life built on my own terms, work that has meaning, people who value me for who I am, not what I represent. Her voice softened. Someone who sees me truly sees me and chooses to stand beside me anyway. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a door opening to possibilities he'd long since stopped considering. That's a lot to want, he said carefully. Too much? Olivia asked, vulnerability plain in her expression. No, Daniel answered honestly. Not too much at all. The moment stretched between them, fragile and filled with unspoken words. Then, from inside the cabin, Prescott began shouting threats again, breaking the spell. Olivia stepped back with a rueful smile. We should prepare for tomorrow. It will be a long day. Daniel nodded, reluctant to let the moment pass, but knowing she was right. I'll check on our guest, make sure he hasn't worked his way loose. As he turned to go inside, Olivia caught his arm. Daniel. When he looked back, she said simply, thank you. For finding me at the well, for everything since. He covered her hand with his own, allowing himself this small contact. Some things are worth finding, Olivia, worth keeping safe. The journey to Silver Creek the following evening was tense but uneventful. They had set out at dusk with Prescott bound and gagged across his own horse, which Daniel led behind Rusty. Olivia rode behind Daniel, her arms wrapped securely around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. Despite the circumstances, Daniel found himself acutely aware of her presence, the trust implicit in the way she held onto him. They reached town as full darkness fell, the streets mostly empty as they made their way first to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Hayes, a grizzled veteran of both the war and frontier law enforcement, listened to their story with increasing interest. Edward Harrington, you say? He mused, examining the documents they'd found in Prescott's pockets. Name sounds familiar. Wasn't he mixed up in that railroad scandal back east a few years ago? Something about bribing officials, Olivia's eyes widened. Yes, though nothing was ever proven. My father helped quash the investigation. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Might be worth sending a telegram to some contacts I have. If Harrington's engaged in illegal activities, that gives us leverage. He locked Prescott in a cell, ignoring the man's protests about false imprisonment. You two go on to Mrs. Miller's. I'll keep this one secure and start making inquiries in the morning. They left their horses at the livery where Olivia's young cousin, Thomas, accepted them with curious glances but no questions, and made their way through the darkened streets to Elizabeth Miller's modest home behind her shop. As promised, she was waiting at the garden gate, a lantern held low to guide them without drawing attention. The reunion between aunt and niece was emotional, with Elizabeth enfolding Olivia in a fierce embrace. My dear girl, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You look so like your mother. Inside, over hot tea and fresh bread, Olivia shared her full story: the pressure to marry Edward, her father's ultimatum, her desperate flight west. Elizabeth listened with growing indignation, occasionally reaching out to squeeze her niece's hand in support. You'll stay with me, of course, she declared when Olivia had finished. This is your home now for as long as you wish it to be. Olivia glanced at Daniel, who had remained quiet throughout, letting her tell her story in her own way. That's very generous, Aunt Elizabeth. But I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Nonsense, Elizabeth said firmly. Family stands together. Besides, Silver Creek is a close-knit community. Once people understand the situation, they'll close ranks around you. We protect our own here. Daniel nodded in agreement. Sheriff Hayes is already looking into Harrington's background. If he finds evidence of illegal activities, it could provide leverage to keep him at bay. And if not, Olivia asked softly, then we face whatever comes, Elizabeth replied, together. She looked between Olivia and Daniel with shrewd assessment. All of us. Later, as the night deepened and Elizabeth retired to her room, Daniel and Olivia found themselves alone in the small parlor. A single lamp burned low, casting warm shadows across the comfortable space. "Will you return to your ranch tomorrow?" Olivia asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Daniel studied the cup in his hands. "I should. The animals need tending and there's always work to be done." He glanced up at her. "But I'll come back in a few days, check on how you're settling in." Olivia nodded, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I'll miss the ranch," she said after a moment. "It came to feel like home even in such a short time." "It's not much," Daniel said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his modest holdings. "It's perfect," Olivia countered gently. Honest, real, like its owner. Heat rose in Daniel's face at her words. "Olivia, she raised a hand to stop him. "I know this isn't the time for declarations. My situation is still precarious, and there are many uncertainties ahead." Her voice softened. "But I want you to know that these days with you have changed me, shown me possibilities I never dared to imagine." Daniel set his cup aside and moved to sit beside her on the small settee. Carefully giving her every opportunity to pull away, he took her hands in his. "When I found you at that well," he said quietly, "I thought I was just helping someone in need. I never expected." "Neither did I," Olivia admitted, her fingers tightening around his. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "That it does," Daniel agreed. Then, gathering his courage, he asked, "When things are settled, when you're truly free to choose your path, would you consider a life that might include my ranch and me?" In the lamplight, Olivia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "I think I'd like that very much," Daniel read. Slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who knows the value of what he holds, Daniel leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss their first, but carrying the promise of many more to come. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Sheriff Hayes's telegrams had yielded unexpected results. Edward Harrington was indeed under investigation for fraud and bribery, and Olivia's testimony about certain conversations she'd overheard could prove valuable to the federal prosecutors building a case against him. With this leverage, Hayes had convinced Prescott to send a carefully worded message to his employer, indicating that Olivia Montgomery had perished in the desert after fleeing the stagecoach. A tragic ending that, while regrettable, neatly resolved the problem of her disappearance. Meanwhile, Elizabeth introduced Olivia to the community as her widowed niece from back east, come to make a fresh start. The people of Silver Creek, practical and accustomed to reinvention, accepted this story without much question. Olivia began helping in the millinery shop, discovering an unexpected talent for design that complemented her aunt's business skills. Daniel rode into town every few days, ostensibly for supplies but primarily to see Olivia. They would walk together along the creek that gave the town its name, sharing stories of their days apart and making tentative plans for a future that seemed increasingly possible. On one such visit, as autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant gold, Daniel found Olivia waiting for him outside the livery as he stabled Rusty. "I have news," she said without preamble, her eyes bright with excitement. A telegram came from the federal marshal's office in Denver. Edward Harrington has been arrested. The evidence was overwhelming once they knew where to look. Daniel's face split in a wide grin. "That's wonderful news, Olivia." "There's more," she continued, taking his hands in hers. "My father has also been implicated. It seems their business dealings were more intertwined than I realized." Her expression sobered slightly. "I should feel vindicated, I suppose, but mostly I feel sad for all the years wasted in that house, living by rules designed to stifle rather than nurture. Daniel squeezed her hands gently. You can't change the past, but the future that's still unwritten. Olivia smiled up at him, the sunlight catching in her hair. Speaking of the future, I've been thinking. A dangerous pastime, Daniel teased. Indeed, she agreed with a laugh. Particularly for a woman in this day and age. She grew serious again. Daniel, I've come to love Silver Creek and the life I'm building here. Aunt Elizabeth has been more family to me in these few weeks than my father was in 20 years. Daniel nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. Was she trying to tell him she'd chosen to stay permanently in town, rather than considering his earlier proposal? But, Olivia continued, every time you ride back to your ranch, I find myself watching the road long after you've disappeared from sight, wishing I were going with you. She took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I don't want to keep saying goodbye to you. Hope bloomed in Daniel's chest. What are you saying, Olivia? I'm saying that I love you, Daniel Reed, she replied simply. I love your strength, your kindness, your integrity. I love the life you've built with your own hands, and I want to be part of it if you'll still have me. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion her words evoked. Then, heedless of who might be watching, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, not the gentle, questioning kiss of their first embrace, but one filled with certainty and promise. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, Olivia Montgomery. Have since I found you at that well, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. She laughed softly. We're quite the pair, aren't we? Both so determined to stand alone that we nearly missed finding each other. Not missed, Daniel corrected, just took a roundabout path. He stepped back slightly, keeping her hands in his. I've been expanding the cabin, added another room, and started on a proper kitchen. It's still not what you're used to, but Olivia silenced him with another kiss. It's perfect because it's ours. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning, with the mountains to the west crowned in their first dusting of snow. The entire town turned out for the occasion, held in Silver Creek's small church, with Sheriff Hayes giving the bride away and Elizabeth serving as witness. Olivia wore a simple gown of ivory silk that she and her aunt had worked on together, adorned with the lace collar that had been her mother's. Daniel, uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, waited at the altar with an expression of wonder that never left his face from the moment Olivia appeared in the doorway. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises of love and partnership spoken in voices that carried clearly through the hushed church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled townsfolk rattled the windows. The celebration continued well into the evening at the town hall, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice their number. As the night deepened, Daniel found his bride standing alone for a moment near the doors, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Having second thoughts, Mrs. Reed? He asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Olivia turned to him with a smile that still took his breath away. Not a single one, Mr. Reed. Just marveling at how far I've come from that desperate woman who collapsed at a dried-up well in the middle of nowhere. Daniel wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. That well wasn't as dried up as it appeared, he reminded her. Sometimes the most precious things are hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Like us, Olivia murmured, leaning into his embrace. Like us, Daniel agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Come on, wife, it's time I took you home. They left the celebration amid good-natured teasing and congratulations, riding together on Rusty under a canopy of stars toward the ranch that would now truly be a home for both of them. As they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, its windows glowing with welcome from the lamps Elizabeth and Thomas had lit earlier in preparation for their arrival, Daniel felt Olivia's arms tighten around his waist. Look at that, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. It's even more beautiful than I remembered. Daniel turned in the saddle to see her face, illuminated by moonlight and happiness. Welcome home, Olivia Reed. The years that followed brought changes to the modest ranch that Daniel had started alone. With Olivia's careful management of their resources and Daniel's hard work, they gradually expanded their holdings, adding cattle and improving the land. The cabin grew too first with the addition of a proper kitchen and dining room, then with bedrooms for the children who soon joined their family. Their first daughter, Eleanor Elizabeth, arrived just 10 months after their wedding, bringing a joy neither had known was possible. She was followed 2 years later by Joseph Daniel, named for Olivia's uncle and his father, a sturdy boy with his mother's blue eyes and his father's quiet determination. The third addition to their family came as a surprise when Olivia was nearly 40, a daughter they named Hope, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm that broke a long drought, seeming to carry the promise of renewal with her first cries. Through it all, the lean years and the prosperous ones, the joys and sorrows that mark any life fully lived, Daniel and Olivia remained each other's steadfast supporters. Their love, born in desperate circumstances beside an almost dry well, deepened and matured with the passing seasons. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Olivia with a journey not to Boston or any grand eastern city, but to the spot where he had found her all those years ago. The abandoned Fletcher homestead had long since crumbled into the desert, reclaimed by the unforgiving landscape, but the stone circle of the well remained. They dismounted their horses and approached it hand in hand, both older now, their faces lined by sun and experience, but their eyes still bright with the same connection that had sparked between them from the beginning. "I never thought I'd be glad to have collapsed from heat exhaustion," Olivia said with a soft laugh, leaning against Daniel's shoulder as they gazed down into the well. "But without that moment of weakness, we might never have found each other." Daniel squeezed her hand, thinking of all they had built together, not just the successful ranch or their 3 remarkable children, but the life they had crafted with love and respect and shared purpose. "Sometimes the most desperate moments lead us exactly where we need to be," he replied, turning to face the woman who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich and meaningful. "I came looking for water that day and found the rest of my life instead." Olivia's smile, still as radiant as it had been on their wedding day, warmed him from within. "And what a life it's been, Daniel Reed." "And what a life still to come," he added, drawing her into his arms as the desert sunset painted the landscape in hues of copper and gold, much as it had on the day their story began when she lay collapsed at the well, and the cowboy found her and brought her water.